Hello everyone, Nathaniel Yavronsky here, and today is Juneteenth, and what I realized that very few people actually have any idea what this is, so let's talk a little bit about it, shall we? Juneteenth, which is June 19th, comes from the year in 1865 at the end of the Civil War. So as you could probably imagine, it might have something to do with slavery. Well, if we're going to talk about the end of slavery, let's rewind a little bit and talk a little bit about how slavery got to North America, how it progressed through the colonial period and during the early times of the United States through the Civil War. Because if we're really going to celebrate the end of something, we need to understand what something was. Slavery is something that is very, very, very bad. And it has happened all across the world from on every ethnic group onto every ethnic group. But we're going to concentrate on North America today. So in the early 1600s, the British would start bringing over blacks to North America in what is now present day Canada and the United States. The Dutch also participated heavily in this in what is now the state of New York. The international slave trade was heavily, influenced by the Dutch, as they were the ones who first started to bring the Africans into the slave trade through their African colonies. And as they were trading with people in Africa, the tribes in Africa were trading prisoners of war for European-made goods. And so that's the sort of beginning of the slave trade. In America, slavery was predominantly in the South, but it was in Canada. Throughout the eastern part of Canada and the eastern seaboard of what would become the United States, slavery was pretty prevalent, including states like New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware. As the Revolutionary War period came upon us, the founding fathers were talking about how they understood and agreed that slavery was morally wrong and was, in contradiction to their beliefs, but they really didn't know how to solve the problem. Many of the founding fathers had slaves. They inherited them and they purchased them. And they were, in this time period, you would not only inherit things, but you would also, assets, you'd also inherit debt. And a lot of the founding fathers were heavily in debt from their parents and from their parents before them. Jefferson happened to be one of these people, and he talked a lot in primary papers and even in one of the drafts of the Declaration of Independence, and how slavery was a problem, but how they were kind of stuck with it, and how a lot of them thought that hopefully maybe that slavery would fall out of favor because as you would move further westward, the land really wasn't set up for that type of agriculture, and it was what they believed that what was going to happen. Technology prevented slavery from being able to die out. In fact, with the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney, slavery exploded. I mean, it grew rapidly, especially in the South. Now, after the Revolutionary period, a lot of the slave owners at the time end up going to Canada because a lot of them were more Tory than they were Patriot. So Nova Scotia in the mid 1780s was the most densely populated slave holding, slave owners, enslaved people area on the planet, because so many of them were actually leaving the new United States to go to British held Canada. The Canadians we're also going through this process of we don't really agree with slavery. We don't really know how to deal with it. And I believe this is actually a character flaw of this time period, because yes, this was an institution that, they didn't create. They acknowledged that it was wrong. They even had power to be able to do some things, and they had just hoped that it would end out on its own versus actually taking direct uh, issue with it to say that this is going to stop at a certain date. Now, in the northern United States, like New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, slavery was ended about 1828. So most of the northern states were free states. Canada, on the other hand, still had slavery up until 1834, 6 years after most of the United States had abolished it. Now, coming into the leading up to the Civil War, you still have a lot of people talk about how slavery is immoral and how it's something that they really need to find a way to get rid of, but they don't. the Democrat Party actually is founded by Andrew Jackson, because he's talking about how a lot of average everyday white people don't have an ability to get a job because of slaves, and that slavery is kind of hurting the average everyday white person in the South, and as well as the rest of the country. And Jackson really hated the aristocratic aspect of British culture, and he saw that the rich slave owning landowners were that same cloth. So instead of trying to fight them and to, get that type of culture out of the U.S., he joined them. In fact, Andrew Jackson's wealth, where Jefferson and Washington and a lot of the founding fathers talked about how they didn't really like slavery, they were kind of stuck with the institution and really didn't want to get rid of it. And if they would let their slaves free, then their creditors could then take them off the street and say, "You were one of Jefferson's slaves, I'm taking you as part of his debt to me." And they would not be able to control if these people would have a peaceful, successful life or not. And this was actually a problem. A lot of Jefferson's slaves end up staying at the Jefferson household after his death and living out their lives there, coming and going as they please, but essentially still being an enslaved person. Doesn't make it right. Slavery is wrong, but this was the choice that a lot of them had, to risk being sent to another place where they lose their family, or to kind of stay with where they were at. A lot of them chose to kind of stay put and slowly migrated, away from the family homestead, every couple generations. It was perilous for a black person, even a free black person, during this time period, because if they were looking for a runaway slave, you were a free black person and say, "Hey, you were the runaway slave." And unless you could verify that you were a free person, they could just easily say, "You're the person we're looking for," and off to slavery you would be. During this time period, people like President Van Buren, were trying to repatriate slaves back to Africa. And President Monroe and Madison, these guys were trying, well, let's just send them back to Africa. So the country of Liberia is created in Africa, with the capital city of Monrovia, the only foreign capital in the world named after a U.S. president, because the United States was trying to deal with how to end slavery and by sending the slaves back to Africa. The problem is that once most of these people got to Africa, they would just apply for passage back to the United States, come into the United States. Many of them would enter in as free blacks and would become slave owners themselves. So it was a very messy problem, and there really wasn't a good solution to how to fix it. Going into the Civil War, you start having a divide with the Democrats and Republicans on states' rights, on how, you're not letting us expand to the South, but you're trying to expand to the North. See, there was a balance in the Senate, and the Senate balance is very important. So you'd only have one state free and one state slave come in at a time. Why? Each state had two senators. They wanted a balance in the Senate. Now, this continued even after the Civil War. So you look at 1889, the Civil War is long over, and you have states on the Northwest trying to come into the Union as Republican states, but there's only one Democrat state ready to come in, and that was the Dakota. So what they do, they cut Dakota into two, creating two Democrat states for the two Republican states. This balance lasted all the way up until 1960, with Alaska coming in as a Democrat state, Hawaii coming in as a Republican state. This was how it was done. It was for a balance in the Senate. And from you looking at the papers, slavery was mostly a pawn. They used the slaves themselves as a pawn in their own political appetite to be able to maintain control and to expand. The expansion wasn't so much about the fear of more slavery, because as you went further west, the land really wasn't good enough for agricultural slavery, which was a thing. But the fact that they could still bring in a slave state, and as you look at the Oregon country, and when Oregon country was brought in and made solidified as part of U.S. territory, well, you can bring in all these free states without, and upset the balance in the Senate. This is a huge component of what was going on here. Slaves were being used as pawns and slave labor. A lot of the poor white and immigrant populations on both sides were pawns in this whole political game. And it just makes it even worse. Than on top of being a slave, you were also a pawn in a political system that you told your citizens was so important to your well-being that we needed to maintain this, we needed to continue this institution because it was for your benefit, when it was clearly not in anyone's benefit except for the really wealthy landowners, the agriculture, the agrarian landowning class that owned all the slaves. And so as you're leading into the Civil War, Lincoln says that, okay, all the rebellion states, this was in September of 1862. On January 1st, 1863, I'm issuing an Emancipation Proclamation. I'm going to free all the slaves in all the rebel-held territory. This did nothing for Maryland. It did nothing for Kentucky. It did nothing for Missouri, which didn't secede from the Union. It also didn't affect Tennessee, because even though Tennessee seceded from the Union, the federal forces had taken control over Tennessee and had installed a military governor in Andrew Johnson. Yes, the Andrew Johnson that would later become Lincoln's vice president. Did his own Emancipation Proclamation to free the slaves in Tennessee, because Lincoln's wouldn't actually affect anyone in Tennessee. And so as you had the southern states start to collapse, you see Lee surrender in April of 65. However, that was just the eastern part of the army. The western part of the army in Texas didn't surrender until June, and on June 2nd. So by the time that the Union got to Galveston, that was the last stronghold of the Confederacy. They were still, having open chattel slavery. And when the Union forces got there, it was very clear, it was a proclamation that, okay, this is done. Slavery is over. We are here. We are in charge. All the laws passed by the Confederate legislature during the Civil War are thrown out, and slavery is now over. All your slaves must be converted from slaves to employees. The relationship is specifically as of employer to employee. All the tools were seen to be, tools that were lent to an employee. And it was actually also advised for the slaves to please stay put until we can kind of figure out what we're going to do here. And a lot of them, again, stayed put. They were supposed to be paid a wage. And the thing is, I don't think they had any way of enforcing this. They really should have worked. This was not a quick and easy solution. This was not very efficient. The whole process of getting rid of slavery from the 16 teens to 1865 was a very long, slow, messy, inefficient, and very bloody process. But on June 19th, 1865, the last stronghold of the Confederate States in Texas, in Galveston, fell, and these slaves were informed of their freedom as of right now, immediately. They could go and come as they pleased. They could do what they wanted as they pleased. And this was a tremendous and great day, not only for the United States and for the blacks that were previously enslaved, but this was a huge turning point in world history. This is the first time that any group of men went and fought and died for the liberation of another group of men. So it was huge for the fact that, the whites were fighting and dying to free the blacks. This is what happened during the Civil War. And it was a very bloody conflict. And it was a reason to have a jubilee because slavery was over. One of the major impacts, and this was a major impact of the war, was slavery, was that it was over. And so in 1866, they celebrated it. In 67, they celebrated it. And as the Great Migration came up, the celebration spread throughout the rest of the country. I mean, it wasn't until December of 65, actually, the 13th Amendment actually get passed and ratified, to where all the states, even the ones that didn't secede, had to abolish slavery. But the fact that those areas that tried to rebel, their slavery was ended on June 19th, 1865. This was a moment that was revered by the black community, the former slave community, and it has celebrated unofficially, for 100 years. And we start getting into the Jim Crow era in the South and the Civil Rights movement. this was still something that mattered because they were free, but they were still being held back. And blacks were held back. Blacks were held back through a lot of different ways. It was, not only the colored, water, colored restrooms. Blacks couldn't use the same restrooms as whites. They couldn't use the same water fountain. They weren't allowed to sit in the front of the bus. The Rosa Parks story. They weren't allowed to go to certain restaurants. Interracial marriages were illegal. And black men couldn't even be inside the city limit of many towns. They were called sunsetter laws. There were a lot of horrible laws on the books up until the 1960s, when these were made, eradicated, were made illegal, and blacks were able to get, a step closer to full equal citizenship in the United States. It wasn't just an overnight thing. This whole thing was a long process. Juneteenth is just one single moment in time along this process that the black community is able to hang on to and say, this was part of this ladder that have been climbing. This is part of this mountain we have been hiking up to the top. It's just one aspect in a much longer history in the United States that involves former slaves and blacks here in the United States, because there were blacks here during Jim Crow that might have immigrated here after the Civil War. They were still treated with the same as any other black person. So there is a process of this more perfect union that we have been working on, and blacks are part of that history of gaining their freedom, gaining their right to vote, getting equal treatment, equal job opportunities, housing opportunities. There's a lot to it. And all 50 states had actually made a proclamation of Juneteenth quite early on. It wasn't until 2021 that the federal government actually recognized it as a federal holiday. All the states had already done so. And I really think that it shows that this country is realizing that this was a major milestone in our history as one people, white and black. That it came to this point to where the whites were fighting for the freedom of black men, and the blacks were fighting for the freedom of black men. And we get to the point to where we are meeting together in this goal, and then the process of healing and then going forward into the future. Do you know that in 2018, black-owned businesses expanded by over 400%? In 2019, black unemployment was 6%. That's the lowest in all of U.S. history. So blacks are on the march. They're on the move forward. They are ascending to great places of status. We've had a black president. We've had black members of the Supreme Court, many blacks, U.S. senators, and black members of the Congress. We are moving in the right direction. We've had great black authors. We've had great black actors. Our whole society has allowed the people who were one-time former, descendants of slaves to be the top tier of our society as a whole. And I believe that is part of that more perfect union that the United States is always striving to be. And I think Juneteenth is just one single moment in time that we can reflect on this passage, on this momentous march to a more perfect union. And we should all be celebrating Juneteenth because of the significance of that. The significance of our country making to a milestone. We should be celebrating all the achievements of so many of these amazing people that have arrived here against their will, who were in chattel slavery, and then started at the very bottom and have now reached some of the top parts of our society. That's what the United States is about. What America is about is being able to transcend all of those transgressions against us as a people, as an ethnic group, as a religious group. Jews were persecuted all over the world. They can come to the United States and they can make it. Asians were being persecuted. Different groups of Asians within all throughout Asia with the different ethnic groups. There's a lot of persecution among themselves. They were able to come here and they were able to make significant rises and be to great esteem here in America. Anyone from any background can come here and become part of this great experiment. And I think Juneteenth is just one of those days in which we can celebrate one of those milestones. And that's the reason why I think everyone should know more about it. We should all openly and excitedly celebrate this holiday, because it is a tremendous, tremendous step in the history of the United States and the process of that more perfect union. And I wanted to make sure that everyone knows a little bit more about it, and that we understand that this was very important, that we should be celebrating this, and that we should try to put some of the, remember the bad things about our past, so we know not to duplicate them, not to recreate them, not to do them over. We should learn from our mistakes. We should try to teach our children, about these mistakes, so they understand the reason why we do the things that we do, why we are still striving to this more perfect union, why we stand up for the little guy, why we stand up for people who are different, why we stand up, what this part of being an American is. And I think Juneteenth is a good way of doing that. So thank you everyone for watching this video. Please like and subscribe, have a discussion, be respectful to each other, and happy Juneteenth. Stay healthy, stay wealthy, and as always, stay wise, America.